In 2015, a space archaeologist named Sarah Parcak was looking at satellite images of Newfoundland, Canada. Not with her eyes, but with software that analyzes infrared signatures invisible to human vision. She was hunting for patterns that might indicate human settlement buried beneath centuries of vegetation and soil. And she found something. Rectangular shapes, soil discoloration suggesting structures, iron deposits consistent with Norse metalworking, all of it about 400 miles south of Lens. Meadows, the only confirmed Viking site in North America. When the announcement came in 2016, it made international headlines. Had archaeologists finally found the second Viking settlement in the Americas? Was this proof that the Norse had explored much further than we thought? By 2017, after excavation, the answer was maybe, or maybe not. The evidence was tantalizing but not definitive, which is frustrating, but also perfectly captures the state of Viking archaeology in North America. We know they were here. We have proof of at least one settlement, but everything else is mystery, controversy, and heated academic debate. Here's what we know for certain. The Vikings didn't just find one place in North America. The medieval sagas describe multiple lands: Helluland, Markland, Vinland, and possibly others that weren't even named. Leif Erikson's voyage alone reportedly encountered 3 distinct coastlines. Other expeditions explored further. So where are the other sites? Where's the evidence? Some of it might be legitimate but unrecognized. Some of it is definitely fake, created by hopeful amateurs or deliberate fraudsters, and some of it might still be buried out there, waiting for the right archaeologist with the right technology to find it. In this video, we're going on a journey through Viking archaeology in North America. You'll discover what the sagas actually say about the lands beyond Vinland, where these places likely were, and why they're so hard to find. We'll examine the most controversial alleged Viking artifacts ever found in North America, from Minnesota to Maine, and learn how to tell genuine archaeology from wishful thinking. We'll explore the cutting-edge technology being used to search for lost Norse sites, and ask the big question: how far south did the Vikings actually go? This is the story of the lands the Vikings found, and then lost to history. Let's start with what the medieval texts actually tell us. The Icelandic sagas that describe Viking voyages to North America were written down in the 13th and 14th centuries, but they claim to record events from around the year 1000 CE. There are 2 main saga accounts: the saga of Eric the Red and the saga of the Greenlanders. They contradict each other on some details, but they agree on the basic geography. According to both sagas, Leif Erikson didn't just sail directly to one place and call it Vinland. He encountered 3 distinct lands on his voyage west from Greenland. The first land he reached was Helluland. The name literally means slab land or flat stone land. The saga describes it as mountainous, covered with glaciers, and having large flat rocks. The sagas say explicitly that Leif looked at this place and decided it was worthless. No trees, no grass, nothing but rock and ice. They didn't even bother going ashore. They just noted it and kept sailing south. Modern historians are fairly confident Helluland was Baffin Island in what's now Arctic Canada. The description fits perfectly. Baffin Island is massive, over 195,000 square miles, making it the 5th largest island in the world. It's mountainous, glaciated, and yes, covered with flat rock formations. For Vikings from tree-starved Greenland, it would have seemed utterly useless. But here's what's interesting. In 2012, archaeologist Patricia Sutherland announced that she'd found evidence of Norse presence on Baffin Island. Not a settlement, but whetstones for sharpening metal tools, yarn, spun using techniques unknown to indigenous peoples of the area, and notched wooden tally sticks similar to those used in Norse Greenland. The artifacts were found at sites occupied by the Dorset people, ancestors of modern Inuit. Sutherland's theory is that these were trading posts, places where Norse explorers and indigenous peoples exchanged goods. The Norse would trade metal goods and cloth for furs and walrus ivory. Not everyone accepts this interpretation. Some archaeologists argue the artifacts could have arrived through indirect trade networks rather than direct Norse presence. But if Sutherland is right, it means the Vikings didn't just sail past Helluland. They stopped, they traded, they left traces. The second land Leif encountered was Markland, meaning forest land or woodland. After Helluland, this must have seemed like paradise. The sagas describe it as flat, forested, with white, sandy beaches. Again, they went ashore briefly, noted the incredible timber resources, and then continued south toward better lands. Markland was almost certainly the coast of Labrador in mainland Canada. The description matches perfectly. Labrador has extensive forests, sandy beaches, and a relatively flat coastal plain. For Vikings from Greenland, where every piece of timber had to be imported or scavenged from driftwood, Markland represented incredible wealth. And we know the Norse returned to Markland long after the initial voyages. The Icelandic annals record a voyage to Markland in 1347, over 3 centuries after Leif Erikson. A small ship from Greenland was blown off course and ended up in Iceland. The crew reported they'd been to Markland for timber. Think about that. The Norse were still sailing to North America in the mid-14th century to gather wood. Markland wasn't a lost land. It was a known resource they exploited for generations. But no one has ever found definitive Norse archaeological evidence in Labrador. Not a settlement, not a temporary camp. Nothing. The dense forests and harsh climate have probably hidden or destroyed anything that might have been there. Or maybe the Norse never stayed long enough to leave much behind. Chop down some trees, load the ship, sail home. No need to build structures. And then there's Vinland itself. The saga descriptions are maddeningly vague about exactly where Vinland was. South of Markland. Warmer climate. Grass that barely withered in winter. Salmon in the rivers. Wild grapes or berries. Timber everywhere. We know the Norse built at least one settlement in this region, Meadows in Newfoundland. But was that Vinland? Or was it a base camp for exploring further south toward the real Vinland? The debate centers on those grapes. Grapes don't grow in Newfoundland. They never have. The climate is too cold. So either the sagas exaggerated or confused berries with grapes, or the Norse explored much further south than Newfoundland, into regions where wild grapes actually grow. Wild. Grapes are native to North America as far north as the St. Lawrence River region, Massachusetts, and southern New Brunswick. If the Vikings actually found grapes, they must have traveled at least as far south as the Gulf of St. Lawrence, possibly much further. This is where archaeology becomes detective work and speculation. Because beyond Meadows, we have no confirmed Norse sites, but we have a lot of claims, controversies, and mysteries. Let's talk about the most famous Viking hoax in American history. In 1898, a Swedish immigrant farmer named Olof Oman claimed to have found a large stone covered in runes while clearing land near Kensington, Minnesota. The inscription, once translated, told an incredible story. A group of Norse explorers, dated to 1362, had traveled deep into the North American interior and been attacked by indigenous peoples. 10 men killed, blood and horror, a desperate message carved in stone. If authentic, the Kensington Runestone would prove that Vikings had not only reached North America, but had explored inland, up rivers, and across lakes, penetrating as far as Minnesota. It would rewrite history. Almost immediately, scholars declared it a fake. The runes were wrong. The language was a mixture of Swedish, Norwegian, and made-up words. The carving style was inconsistent with medieval technique. The whole thing looked like something a 19th-century Scandinavian immigrant with partial knowledge of runes might create. But here's what's fascinating. Despite being thoroughly debunked by academic consensus, the Kensington Runestone has passionate defenders to this day. Books have been written arguing for its authenticity. Geologists have examined the weathering patterns. Linguistic experts have offered alternative interpretations. The stone now sits in a museum in Alexandria, Minnesota, where it's treated as a local treasure regardless of its authenticity. And this illustrates something important about Viking archaeology in North America. There's a desire, particularly among people of Scandinavian descent, to find evidence of Norse presence. This desire sometimes overwhelms critical thinking. The Kensington stone is almost certainly fake, but understanding why people believed in it and why some still do tells us something about the appeal of Viking history in America. If you're enjoying this exploration of lost Viking sites, drop a like to help the channel. Takes a second and makes a real difference. Now, let's look at some discoveries that are much harder to dismiss. In 1957, an amateur archaeologist hunting for indigenous artifacts at a site in Maine found something that didn't belong. Among thousands of indigenous stone tools and pottery fragments, there was a single, small silver coin. When experts examined it, they identified it as a Norwegian penny, minted sometime between 1065 and 1080 CE. Right in the middle of the Viking Age, the Goddard Point penny is genuine. No one disputes that it's a real Norse coin from the 11th century. The question is, how did it get to Maine? There are three possibilities. First, Vikings actually traveled as far south as Maine, either landing there or trading with indigenous peoples who lived there. Second, the coin arrived through indigenous trade networks. A coin given to someone in Newfoundland or Labrador could have been traded south through multiple exchanges over decades or centuries. Third, the coin was dropped at the site much later, perhaps by a collector in the 20th century. Most archaeologists favor the trade network explanation. A single coin, found among thousands of indigenous artifacts, most likely arrived through trade rather than direct Norse presence. But it does prove something important. Objects from the Norse world were circulating in northeastern North America during the Viking Age, and it raises a tantalizing question. If a coin could travel that far, what else might be out there? In 1960, archaeologist Helga Ingstad found Lance, or Meadows. Before that discovery, most historians dismissed the Vinland sagas as myth. Ingstad proved them wrong. Ever since then, archaeologists have been searching for the second site, the place that would prove Lance Meadows wasn't a lone anomaly. Dozens of sites have been proposed over the decades. Most turned out to be indigenous settlements, natural formations, or, in a few cases, deliberate hoaxes. But some remain intriguing. In the 1960s and 70s, archaeologists investigated a series of stone structures in New England that some claimed were Viking or even earlier European settlements. These included the Newport Tower in Rhode Island, various stone chambers in New Hampshire and Vermont, and scattered stone formations across Massachusetts. The Newport Tower is particularly interesting. It's a 28-foot stone structure that's been standing in Newport since at least the 1670s. Some enthusiasts claimed it was a Norse church or watchtower, pointing to architectural similarities with medieval Scandinavian buildings. Radiocarbon dating killed that theory. Analysis of mortar from the tower dated it to the mid-17th century, consistent with the colonial period. The tower was almost certainly built by early English colonists, possibly as a windmill support. Not Vikings, just wishful thinking and architectural coincidence. But the searches continued, because the mathematics were compelling. If Vikings built one settlement in Newfoundland, if they gathered timber regularly from Labrador, if they explored south looking for grapes and better land, they must have left other traces, somewhere. In 2015, Sarah Parcak and a team from the National Geographic Society announced they'd found something. Satellite imagery had identified a site at Point Rosee on the southwestern coast of Newfoundland, about 400 miles south of Meadows. The infrared signatures suggested buried structures and iron deposits. When they excavated in 2015 and 2016, they found evidence of ironworking, a turf wall, post holes that might indicate structures. It looked promising, very promising. National Geographic covered it extensively. Could this be the second Viking site everyone had been searching for? Was this proof of more extensive Norse exploration? By 2017, the enthusiasm had cooled considerably. More detailed analysis suggested the iron deposits were probably natural bog iron, common in that environment. The turf wall might have been natural. The site had definitely been occupied, but by indigenous peoples, not necessarily Norse. The lead archaeologist, Douglas Bolender, eventually concluded that Point Rosee probably wasn't a Norse site after all. Possibly indigenous, possibly nothing more than natural features misinterpreted as structural. It was disappointing, but it also showed how sophisticated Viking archaeology has become. Satellite technology, soil chemistry, radiocarbon dating, comparative analysis. We have tools that Helga Ingstad couldn't have dreamed of in 1960, and yet we still can't find the second site, if it exists. We're getting to the most fascinating part of this mystery. If you're not subscribed yet, this is a good time. There's new content here every week exploring history's unsolved puzzles. Now let's talk about how far south the Vikings could realistically have traveled and why it's so incredibly hard to find evidence even if they were there. The Vikings were exceptional sailors. Their ships could handle open ocean voyages that would terrify most medieval Europeans. They had navigational knowledge passed down through generations. They understood currents, winds, and how to read the North Atlantic. From Meadows, sailing south along the North American coast would have been relatively straightforward. Follow the coastline. Stop for fresh water and repairs. Keep going. There's no physical reason they couldn't have reached Massachusetts, New York, or even further. The question is, did they? Let's consider the evidence carefully. Wild grapes grow as far north as the St. Lawrence River region and Massachusetts. If the Vinland sagas are describing actual grapes, not berries or some mistranslation, then the Norse must have reached at least that far. That's roughly 800 miles south of Meadows. The climate argument supports this. The sagas describe Vinland as having grass that barely withered in winter, mild temperatures, and abundant resources. Newfoundland doesn't fit that description well, but Massachusetts, southern New England, that fits much better. Archaeologist Birgitta Wallace, who excavated Meadows extensively, has argued that the site was probably not Vinland itself, but rather a staging base, a place to repair ships, store supplies, and launch explorations further south. The buildings at Meadows are too small to represent a serious colonization attempt. They look more like a temporary base camp. If Wallace is right, then the real Vinland, the place with grapes and mild winters, is somewhere further south, still undiscovered. So why can't we find it? Several reasons, all frustrating. First, Vikings built with wood and turf, materials that decompose completely in a few centuries, especially in wet climates. Meadows only survived because it was abandoned quickly and the remains were sealed under soil. A site that was occupied longer, with structures rebuilt multiple times, might leave even less evidence, because the layers would be disturbed. Second, sea level changes. The North Atlantic coastline has changed significantly over the past 1,000 years. A coastal settlement from 1000 CE might now be underwater or buried under meters of sediment. Third, Vikings didn't leave much trash. Unlike later European colonizers who brought ceramics, glass, and metal objects they discarded freely, the Vikings traveled light and reused everything. Finding Viking artifacts at a site is rare even when we know Vikings were there. Fourth, The indigenous populations already living in these areas also built structures, used fire, worked wood, and left post holes and hearths. Distinguishing a Viking site from an indigenous site without clear artifacts is nearly impossible. And fifth, there simply might not be much to find. If the Norse pattern in North America was similar to their pattern in Markland, quick visits to gather resources, no permanent settlement, then they might have left almost nothing behind. A temporary camp occupied for a few weeks leaves very little archaeological signature. But let's speculate carefully based on what we know. The Norse had reason to explore south. They needed timber constantly. They wanted better farmland. They were curious explorers by culture. They had the ships and skills to do it. The coast from Newfoundland to Massachusetts offers protected harbors, abundant resources, and relatively mild climate. If I were a Viking captain looking for the best place to establish a colony, I'd keep sailing until I found something significantly better than cold, rocky Newfoundland. The Gulf of Maine region would have been very attractive. Protected waters, countless islands for safe anchorage, forests right down to the shoreline, abundant fish and game, and yes, wild grapes in the southern areas. Is there evidence they reached that far? Nothing definitive. But there are some curious footnotes in history that make you wonder. The indigenous peoples of the northeastern coast, particularly the Mi'kmaq of Nova Scotia and the Abenaki of Maine, have oral traditions that mention people who came from the sea long before European colonization. Bearded strangers with different clothes and tools. Most historians dismiss these as confused memories of later European contact, but some are oddly specific about timing, suggesting encounters that might predate the colonial era. There's also the question of genetics. Some studies have suggested possible Norse genetic markers in indigenous populations of the Canadian Maritimes, though this research is controversial and difficult to confirm. And then there are the mysterious stone structures. New England has dozens of stone chambers, cairns, and formations that don't match known indigenous construction styles. Most are probably colonial-era root cellars, animal pens, or property markers. But a few remain unexplained. Without clear artifacts or datable structures, though, all of this remains. Speculation. Interesting speculation, but speculation nonetheless. What would it take to find the second Viking site, if it exists? More technology helps. Ground-penetrating radar, LiDAR mapping, satellite analysis, chemical signatures in soil. These tools have revolutionized archaeology in recent decades, but we also need luck. Helga Ingstad found Lance o' Meadows by walking around asking local fishermen if they'd seen old ruins. Sometimes the best archaeological tool is just being in the right place at the right time. And we need patience. Viking archaeology in North America attracts plenty of amateurs with metal detectors and certainty. It attracts treasure hunters who damage sites looking for artifacts to sell. It attracts true believers who see Vikings everywhere. What it needs is careful, systematic, skeptical archaeology that's willing to say, "We don't know," when the evidence isn't clear. The truth is probably less dramatic than the enthusiasts hope, and more interesting than the skeptics assume. The Vikings almost certainly explored further south than Lance o' Meadows. They probably established temporary camps, gathered resources, traded with indigenous peoples, and then left. They didn't build cities. They didn't conquer territory. They came, looked around, decided it wasn't worth the effort, and went home. But somewhere out there, buried under 1,000 years of soil, vegetation, and coastal changes, there might be post holes from a Norse longhouse. Slag from an iron forge, a few corroded nails, a whetstone for sharpening axes, small things, fragile things, easily missed things. And if we find them, we'll rewrite the map of Viking exploration in North America one more time. So let's recap what we know and don't know about Viking lands beyond Vinland. We know the sagas describe at least 3 lands: Helluland, Markland, and Vinland. We're reasonably confident about where Helluland and Markland were, Baffin Island and Labrador, respectively. Vinland's exact location remains debated. We know the Norse returned to Markland for timber for centuries after the initial voyages. This wasn't a one-time exploration. It was ongoing exploitation of known resources. We know that only one confirmed Norse site exists in North America, Meadows in Newfoundland. Despite decades of searching with increasingly sophisticated technology, we haven't found a second settlement. We know there are tantalizing hints of Norse presence further south and further inland, a coin in Maine, possible trade goods on Baffin Island, controversial artifacts scattered across eastern North America, but nothing definitive, nothing that proves Vikings traveled beyond the immediate North Atlantic coast. And we know that most alleged Viking discoveries in North America are either hoaxes, misidentifications, or wishful thinking. The Kensington stone is fake. The Newport Tower is colonial. The stone chambers of New England are probably root cellars. But here's what makes this story so compelling. The absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Vikings were absolutely capable of sailing as far south as Massachusetts or even further. They had the ships, the skills, and the motivation. The fact that we haven't found proof they did doesn't mean they didn't. Archaeology is patient work. Helga Ingstad spent years searching for Vinland before finding Meadows. The site had been sitting there for 9 centuries, unmarked and unknown, until someone knew what to look for and where to look. Somewhere along the coast of North America, there might be another site like that, waiting for the right archaeologist with the right question and the right technology to find it. What does this search reveal about how we understand history? A few things, I think. First, it shows the power of written sources. Without the Icelandic sagas, we might never have looked for Viking sites in North America at all. Even when most historians dismiss the sagas as legend, those texts preserved a memory of real events across centuries. The sagas were right about Vinland. Maybe they're right about other things we haven't confirmed yet. Second, it demonstrates the importance of skepticism in archaeology. For every genuine discovery like Meadows, there are dozens of false leads, hoaxes, and misinterpretations. Good archaeology means being willing to say, probably not, even when you want the answer to be yes. Third, it reminds us that exploration doesn't always lead to permanent settlement. The Vikings found North America. They built structures. They explored the coasts. And then they left. Not because they were defeated or driven out, though conflicts with indigenous peoples certainly played a role, but because the enormous distance from Greenland, the small population available for colonization, and the presence of established indigenous populations made permanent settlement impractical. And finally, it tells us that history still has secrets. 1,000 years isn't that long ago. Humans have been exploring and settling every corner of Earth for tens of thousands of years. But we still have gaps in our knowledge, still mysteries unsolved, still empty spaces on the map waiting to be filled in. The lands beyond Vinland, Helluland, Markland, and whatever other coasts the Vikings explored aren't truly lost. They're right there on modern maps. What's lost is the evidence of Norse presence, the traces of their passing, the physical proof that they were here. But soil keeps secrets. Coastlines hide their past. And sometimes, if you know where to look and how to look, the Earth gives up what it's been holding for centuries. The search continues. And maybe somewhere, a graduate student with ground-penetrating radar or an amateur archaeologist with sharp eyes will find the second site. The proof that the Vikings explored further than we currently know. Until then, we have the sagas. We have Meadows. We have tantalizing hints and frustrating mysteries. And we have the knowledge that the Vikings looked west from Greenland, saw a continent, and decided to find out what was there. They found more than we've yet discovered. And that's a thrilling thought. And that was the story of Viking lands beyond Vinland, the search for lost Norse sites, and the ongoing mystery of how far south the Vikings actually traveled. If you made it this far, thanks for staying with me through this archaeological journey. These deep dives into historical mysteries take serious research time, and knowing there are people watching until the end makes it worthwhile. If you enjoyed this, subscribe to the channel. Every week, there's new content exploring the overlooked corners of history, the unsolved mysteries, and the stories that don't make it into textbooks. Next week, I'll be covering another archaeological mystery that challenges everything we thought we knew about ancient exploration. You won't want to miss it. Leave in the comments. Did you know about these Viking exploration controversies before this video? Do you think there are more Norse sites waiting to be discovered? And what other archaeological mysteries should I cover? Until next time, keep questioning what you think you know about history.